Hey, and welcome back. As a drummer doing a wide variety of styles in performing, recording, and teaching, I found myself needing different kits to complement each other musically. In the last few years, in my studio, I've rotated between 3 drum sets: a small jazz bebop kit, a vintage kit, and an all-around modern kit. My jazz kit is the standard 18-inch bass drum, 12-inch rack tom, and 14-inch floor tom. And the vintage kit is very similar, but with a 20-inch bass drum. For the modern kit, I've had a set with another 20-inch bass drum, but with 10, 12, and 14-inch toms. When I bought it, it was a great deal used, and at the time, I didn't really feel the need for a larger bass drum and enjoyed the compact setup of a 20-inch kick. In the last few months, working on a variety of rock and pop projects, I felt more compelled to find a larger bass drum and a larger floor tom to contrast my drums I already have. Typically, buying component drums or add-on drums to an existing set can be really expensive and hard to justify in comparison to buying an entire new kit. But luckily, I was able to find a matching 16-inch floor tom with relative ease, and within a week, for little investment, I now had half of what I was searching for. I reached out to a friend of mine with the same kit and offered to trade my 20-inch bass drum for his 22.
We got 22 by 18.
Thankfully, the trade worked out well for both of us, and I now had a matching 22 by 18-inch bass drum for this modern set. I'm not a huge fan of deeper drums, so I decided quickly I wanted to cut this shell's depth down. I started by removing all the tension rods, claws, hoops, and heads, and then after that, I unscrewed all the hardware attached to the shell, like lugs, bass drum brackets, and the badge. As a fan of more traditional drum sizes, my goal was to cut this shell down from an 18-inch depth to a 14-inch depth. This isn't always an option for every drum, depending on the lug layout, tom brackets, and a few other factors, but on this drum, a 14-inch depth would work as long as I'd be okay with plugging one hole from each of the original lugs. This wasn't ideal, but with these Gretsch drums having their wrap peeled back a half-inch or so from the bearing edge, and the collar of the bass drum head covering up that last 3/4 of an inch or so from the edge of the drum, I'd be able to plug these holes and have them be covered by the collar anyways, leaving it unseen. I added tape to the inside and outside of the drum where I'd be cutting to prevent splintering from the saw blade, and took this drum upstairs to cut. I added some tape to the cast iron plate of my table saw to protect my shell from any scratching, and I then got my fence placed exactly where I'd need it to do this cut. This is probably the most frightening part of this process, weighing the potential for something to go wrong and make a huge mistake. After cutting this shell down, I removed any leftover tape and went over the flat edge with some sandpaper to clean it up a bit. I then moved on to plugging these 10 holes left from the old lugs. I started by adding tape to the outside of the shell to keep any glue squeeze out from getting on the wrap. Then, I filled each hole with a small cutoff from a dowel. After these dowels had dried, I came back with the flush cut saw and trimmed them right up to the shell. And then I came back after with a sanding block to clean it up a bit more. Next, I moved on to trimming the wrap away from the edge about 3/8 of an inch. I made a quick jig for this by taping a razor blade to a piece of scrap wood the same thickness as I needed, and then I scored the wrap all the way around the shell. After the wrap was scored, I came back and peeled away the wrap very carefully using a razor blade to break any spots where the glue was still between the shell and the wrap. I took a lot of time to do this very slowly in order to avoid any chance of tearing away any of the wrap beyond that 3/8 of an inch reveal. After I had the wrap reveal completed, I shifted my attention back to the plug holes and decided I need a dowel just a hair thicker to get a better bond. It was the same process again, but this time with a dowel 1/16 of an inch thicker. I had to sand these dowels down a hair before they'd fit with the glue, but I felt way better about these plugs than before, and it was worth taking the extra time to get this done right. I cut these dowels down flush to the shell again, and then used a combination of sanding block and a Dremel tool to sand the dowels flush with the contour of the shell. After I had the dowels looking much better, I took this drum over to my router table to cut new bearing edges. I did a very small chamfer on the outside, and then did a few passes on the inside, gradually working my way up towards matching the factory edge. This is something I've done to a lot of drums at this point, and I started out with crappy orphan drums before ever trying to cut edges on a drum as nice as this. If you're planning to start learning how to cut bearing edges yourself, I'd recommend getting a number of reps in on some cheap drums before ever working on a single drum that might cost $1,000 or more to replace. After I had my new bearing edges cut, it was time to lay out the new holes needed for the lugs. I used a combination square to transfer the hole locations from the original lug holes by tracing a vertical line across the shell and then setting the depth of the horizontal lines on the square as well. This is a super efficient way to do this and pretty much guarantees each of these new marks will be identical to each other. Once I had the lug holes laid out, I used a punch to mark these holes and keep my drill bit from drifting at all, and then proceeded to drill out each hole. I repeated the process for all 10 lugs and 20 holes. I did these 2 to 4 holes at a time, going in and confirming a lug would fit before moving on, just in case something was off before drilling every hole. Once I had all the lug holes drilled, I shifted my attention to the tom bracket. I reached out to a fellow Gretsch friend, and he sent me this graphic with the exact hole pattern for this mount. It's important when you do this to measure from the batter side, so that the tom mount is always the same measurement from that edge in order to keep the toms in a position where they end up roughly around the same spot to you as the player. So on an 18-inch deep shell, the tom bracket would be more towards the center of the drum, while on a 14-inch drum, it's much closer to the resonant side head. I drilled out the tom post hole first using a 1-inch hole saw, and then I could use the plate as a template while drilling out the 4 mounting holes. I made sure to check for square from the edge while doing this so I wouldn't get a crooked plate, and just took my time constantly measuring and double checking for square. Once I had these holes drilled, I could install this tom bracket and be assured that everything worked out, and then it was time to take this drum downstairs and reassemble. I reattached all the lugs, bass drum spurs, and then moved on to the heads, hoops, claws, and tension rods. I added some drum dial bearing edge conditioner to the fresh bearing edge just to seal the edge before adding a drum head.
The next day.
After a shipment from Sweetwater arrived, I removed the original head and swapped it out for this Evans Black EQ3 ported head. I don't mind the fiberskin head, but it's a bit of a different sound than I was looking for with this kit. A subscriber of my channel sent me a handful of these vintage Gretsch Broadcaster logo decals he made, and I decided to use one on this head. I've already made a separate video about applying logo decals like this, so check that out if you want to know more about my process. While swapping out this head, I also remembered I'd forgotten to install the badge. Unfortunately, I couldn't just screw it back on the original holes, as they were too close to the batter side bearing edge, so I used the combination square to transfer the vertical and horizontal layout for 2 new holes before drilling them out. After that, I could add the bolts, washers, and nuts, and tighten them on before reattaching the batter head. And just like that, this drum was finished and I could add it back into my set. Overall, I'm happy with how this turned out, and as I've gotten to play this drum, it gets a deeper tone than my previous 20-inch kick, but also has a very controlled, punchy sound from the 14-inch depth. I've always enjoyed traditional depth drums, and felt the extended depths on more modern drums aren't always necessary. It seems to be coming back into style for a lot of drum companies, and Gretsch even offers a renowned kit with the 22 by 14-inch bass drum in one finish available exclusively through Sweetwater. One of my other hesitations from switching from a smaller 20-inch bass drum to a 22 was my students. I use this kit as my primary teaching kit, and I have plenty of younger students that are smaller, and I think the smaller kit makes positioning and reach a lot easier for them. But when I started using this set with my students, most of them actually found this kit to be easier to play on because their kits at home have 22-inch bass drums. I never really considered familiarity being more important than reach or comfort, but turns out they appreciate it as well. So for me, my solution to cut down a pre-existing drum instead of purchasing a new kit or component drum ended up being a win not only in regards to flexibility and variety, but also financially. I was able to do this whole project with very little investment, and it only took me a day to complete. I do regret not doing a before and after comparison of this drum, but I was under a time crunch to get this done so I could get back to teaching on it as quickly as possible. If you have a preference of bass drum depth, leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. Until next time, thanks.